Today, what I want to talk about is what I hope to be a very sort of like candid and frank conversation about crowdsourcing data for humanitarian assistance. Both, what we at Premise and I have personally seen as some of the main, sort of opportunities for applying this, as well as some of the situations where it doesn't work, or for it to work, it involves, sort of like a rethink of how the sort of like standards and processes for humanitarian data collection can be applied when the people providing that data are local citizens. But to kind of kick us off and get us in the right mindset, I want to start with like, why do this differently at all, right? Like, why, try to change the way everything from, needs assessments to market studies are done? And, I think for us, we see sort of like three, main problems that crowdsourcing presents an opportunity to try to fix. So the first is, and I think especially for a early onset crisis or one that's changing really rapidly, one thing that we see in the community is needs assessment data collection, especially the more rapid appraisal stuff that is very reliant on key informants. And I think that makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? Where it's like, okay, if you've got to be able to collect data quickly, find, people that are already involved in the response and ask them to provide some more sort of like qualitative data about what's happening in the place where they live. The challenge is that there is not a ton of evidence that using a key informant to, complete a survey that is really designed to be quantitative, if you've seen like a Hesper scale, like asking somebody to rate the severity of needs in their community for the community as a whole, really works, right? And so we end up in this situation where we're, relying on the opinions of a relatively small group of people to understand what the needs are. And there's a strong desire amongst many in the community to be able to not get rid of that, but to complement that with something that's a bit more quantitative, even if it's done under a little bit different of a standard for compared to how a multi-sector needs assessment would be done. And so here, this is obviously sort of like the gold standard for really understanding needs in a way that is extremely rigorous, has strong statistical power, usually at a very low administrative level, so that you can make comparisons. The challenge with the MSNA that we see is that, if everybody got to put every indicator that they wanted into this, it would be way too long for anybody to feasibly complete. And so there becomes this sort of process of, horse trading, we say in English, but negotiating a lot of trade-offs. And at the end of the day, the health sector doesn't get cluster doesn't get everything they want. The watch cluster doesn't get everything they want. And so you end up with some demand for data that ultimately doesn't get met by the MSNA. And if data collection were cheap enough that you could just be running more needs assessments, then everybody could get the data that they wanted. And then I think the third piece, and this is like probably the most obvious one, but in a lot of humanitarian settings, all the information has an extremely short shelf life. If you think about particularly the first like 6 or 7 months of the war in Ukraine, where the lines of control were shifting quite dramatically, suddenly you would have entire oblasts or portions of an oblast that were under Ukrainian control, and now you need another area-based assessment, and then you need another area-based assessment, right? And so sort of like keeping up with that pace is something that puts a lot of stress on the way that this type of data is traditionally collected. And so, one of the underlying challenges that we see as contributing to those ones I just laid out is that there hasn't been a ton of innovation in how primary field data collection is done. We've obviously seen, uses of, sort of second or third party data sets that were built for something else. We've seen a lot of use of data from Meta or Facebook, for example, and responses in both Ukraine and Turkey. But when it comes to actually generating primary data in the field, it's still very based on either enumeration that involves going door to door, that is expensive and slow and pretty tedious to manage, or using some sort of computer-assisted telephone interviews that aren't always appropriate for all the types of data collection that we need. For example, CADI interviews don't work very well for damage building assessments, right? And so this is not meant to be a premise sales pitch, but it is probably necessary for me to talk just very briefly about how it works. For us, we see a major opportunity to turn this type of data collection into something that ordinary citizens can do on their own. And there's really three phenomena that we see contributing to that. The first is that the average cost of a smartphone, especially a used smartphone, which are now widely available in low and middle income countries, is down to $31. This is based off data that we've collected using internal surveys. It's a little harder to find this data from other parties, but basically, a much larger portion of the world's population is able to afford a smartphone than was true 4 or 5 years ago. Second, we've seen a commensurate increase in smartphone adoption in low and middle income countries that we think is pretty correlated to that. This data comes from GSMA, so I think we have some pretty high confidence in it. But basically, way more people are owning smartphones. And then lastly, we've also seen a really big increase in the participation in the gig economy in low and middle income countries. And this number is really like the formal gig economy, right? This is the Rappies of the world. Informally, that's obviously a huge part of how many people earn their livelihoods in low and middle income countries. So there's an increased familiarity with the idea that you might have some sort of job that you do part-time or just on occasion that you access through your phone. And so, what we've done is try to make it possible to crowdsource data from local citizens by taking advantage of those opportunities, but still do it in such a way that doesn't involve lots of compromises when it comes to the standards that are required to be able to do this data collection. And the way we do it is we have an app. We've got just shy of 6 million people on it, and they get paid to do data collection tasks, both surveys as well as observational data collection in the communities where they live as gig work, just like they were, working for Rappi, for example. We're in 144 countries, 40 languages. I should update my slide a little bit, but our goal is to be everywhere or almost everywhere. And on top of that, we've built a web application that's used by organizations like IMAP and I'm sure some others in this room to build data collection tasks that respond to their organization's requirements, publish it to that network, have them collect the data, quality control all of it, and then show back up in the web application to sort of, which lets you kind of like manage your data collection as it happens, as well as do a lot of basic descriptive analysis. So this is the real meat of this. Like, what are some of the opportunities that we've seen for this? Like, what areas where this approach we think works pretty well? So one is for needs assessments, right? I think in particular, premises, and I don't think this is just premise. I would say probably crowdsourcing as a phenomenon is not going to be a great way to do a multi-sectoral needs assessment because it becomes very hard to hit your sampling frames for every single rayon in Ukraine. But if what you want to do is something that is cluster or sectoral specific, where you couldn't get all of your indicators into that, or you needed it more frequently and you were willing to have sort of representation at a higher administrative level, then it can work pretty well for that. We're able to get enough people on our app, keep them engaged. It also works best in countries with relatively high smartphone ownership. So I'm going to show an example from Ukraine here in a second, but smartphone ownership in Ukraine is basically the same as it is here in the US. And there are some things that you can do in low-income countries where smartphone ownership is lower to try to use a mix of interviews as well as surveying people that are on your app directly. And then lastly, it tends to work best in situations where a significant portion of the population is affected by the crisis, right? If it is something that is hyper-local, it's one specific instance of conflict that affects 4 villages, is probably not a great solution. But so, like, what does success look like? Over the last year, Premise has been working with the World Health Organization in Ukraine, and the gist is they've been running rounds of their own, sort of health needs assessments, as well as kind of area-based assessments as the lines of control changed, plus an extra effort to sort of understand what's going on in the occupied oblast. And this works well because this whole thing, I think if you add this up, it's probably 6 different surveys across 10,000 respondents. This is like $50,000, right? So it makes it cheap. All this data collection gets done in between 2 and 4 weeks, and it's totally digital from the start, right? So it sort of cuts down the amount of like data cleaning and management that's required for this. So that's one good setting. I think the second is we've seen this work pretty well for market studies, or at least the parts of market studies that involve collecting data on food and staple good pricing, as well as survey data from specific market actors. It can also work well for the household data portion of a market study in the event that a significant portion of the population is affected. But if it's a smaller portion of the population, that can be hard to get the representative data you need from just certain villages or just migrant populations, for example, right? I do also think there's kind of an added benefit to this, and it can be a really scalable way for also identifying vendors that could be part of a voucher program, which sort of like increases, I think, the sort of like fairness or to local businesses who would like for beneficiaries to be able to redeem their vouchers with them, but maybe there is no like strong existing database of those market actors to draw on. And then the last one I want to share is we have seen that this can be a really good solution for doing damaged building assessment. That doesn't require, if really you're just looking to map them and get a general sense of the damage, then it doesn't require sort of like a specific background in engineering, then it can work pretty well. It works much better when that damage is the result of natural disasters, because the safety of the person doing the mapping is much easier to manage than in an active conflict where we're not really doing this. And additionally, it does tend to be most effective when it's combined with satellite imagery, because I think if any of you live in a country where you have the ability to report something to your city or local government using an app, in the US we call this 311, what you'll find is like you will only get data from the most active and concerned citizens, and then you'll have a bunch of blank spots on your map where you don't really know what's happening. But if instead you can create tasks to visit places using satellite imagery, validate that that is indeed a damaged building, and collect more attribute data about that place, then it allows you to do this in a way that is significantly more comprehensive than just sort of asking people to report, any damaged buildings in their neighborhood. That works pretty well. We've done a ton of this in the areas of Turkey that were affected by the earthquake, across a bunch of different governorates, and we've sort of found that this can be one of the most like rapid ways that you can do this. What are some of the challenges to this type of an approach, or like areas where it doesn't work? And I think, like, as a whole, I would group these challenges as in this bucket of when you try to replicate conventional data collection methods one-to-one, then you start to get a lot of challenges coming up. So there are some challenges that we have found we have been able to replicate, but it wasn't easy. So first, visibility requirement. It makes a lot of sense that somebody doing data collection in a humanitarian setting should be visibly identified as doing so with a hat or a vest or a badge or all of the above. Challenge is, you add a whole extra logistics layer of finding vendors in potentially everywhere in a country who can manufacture those t-shirts or whatever, and then run the sort of like logistics of a number of local citizens picking these up, some of which might just decide later on that they don't want to do this anymore, because this is all, like voluntary, right? I mean, you get paid, but nobody is like a full-time premise employee doing this. But we've mostly been able to manage that. The second, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse training. This honestly wasn't so bad once we partnered with IMAP to sort of like build a training methodology that made sense based on kind of how premise works. And now what we do is allow our contributors to complete that, in advance of any of this data collection happening, so that they can basically get pre-certified. And then the last is credentialing by the local government in advance of those people going out and doing data collection. And the place where we run into this the most is data collection from healthcare facilities. Because if like what you wanted to understand, for example, was the stock of essential or emergency medicines. We did some of this with direct relief at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Not everyone is going to give that data to an ordinary citizen, even with a t-shirt or a vest. And so, what we found is in some settings, having a letter from the government embedded directly into the app so that you can show it to them works pretty well. And, the partners that we work with have been able to obtain those authorizations. But if it needs to be printed, which is usually, more for cultural reasons, well, then you add the additional logistics layer. And so there becomes this barrier to entry for a local citizen to get involved in this, because it is going to be, it's going to take more of their time, right? But all of these have been possible. Again, not to toot IMAP's horn too much, but thanks to a lot of help from them, we've mostly been able to overcome these bars. There are then some challenges that we have found mostly impossible to replicate. So the first is around field supervision. What we have found is when the person doing the data collection is doing this when they're able to, as opposed to like, I'm going to do this all week, 8 hours a day. It becomes very hard to know exactly at what time they will do the data collection. And because of that, it's basically impossible to have a field supervisor, watch them do it or spot audit this. Now, in our opinion, we make up for this through a lot of really great and smart data quality control measures that leverage the sensors in the smartphone, to some extent use machine learning based on, contributors that we've suspended in the past, looking at their metadata, looking for people we should investigate further. But we basically cannot have a field supervisor follow one of our contributors around, while they're doing the data collection. And that's actually tied to the second one. Because of the nature of our model, we don't collect personal identifiable information about our contributors beyond what is required to pay them. And on top of that, we cannot then provide that little bit of PII we do have, which is just their name and contact information, to any of our customers. So you can't call them later and ask them questions about the data collection, because frankly, that breaks our ability to stay compliant with GDPR. As I sort of alluded to already, what we have found is that data collection that has to be done at a highly specific time doesn't work very well. A specific day is okay. We've done a lot of, monitoring of immunization sessions, both at a healthcare facility level and in the field. And those immunization sessions maybe only happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But if it has to be done at a specific time, it becomes hard for a contributor to manage this on top of whatever their other income sources are. And in particular, we've run into this issue in areas where a large portion of our contributor base works in agriculture, because it's much easier for them to do data collection outside the sort of like main hours of the workday.
Chris, allow me to.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Chris. Allow me to jump in one moment. We are a bit past our time, so
well, that was my last 2 points anyway. So yeah.
Good. Well, I welcome you to finish those last few points, and then we should have at least a few minutes for some Q&A. So please go ahead.
Sure. Well, the last two are easy. Look, I mean, we don't specialize in sort of recruiting and trained engineers onto our app, and I think in general that sort of like starts to break the whole idea of crowdsourcing. So that's one where we found this doesn't work super well. If your use case requires that type of expertise, crowdsourcing might not be the best way to do it. And then the last is key informant interviews, and that's mostly because it's extremely hard to quality control whether somebody was actually talking to a village leader, for example. So thanks for your patience, and sorry I ran a little over, but hopefully we've got time for a couple questions.